Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in every given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. Thus are the words of Viktor E. Frankl, author of Man's Search for Meaning, which I would like to talk about a little bit today. One of my favorite kind of, I guess, nonfiction kind of psychology, and I don't want to call it self-help, but it definitely does help. It's it's about his quite a well-known, as it should be, book by the psychiatrist, I think, psychologist, founder of logotherapy, meaning implied by the root word, logos meaning meaning, that's redundant, but also knowledge, I think, knowledge and meaning kind of, so it's, I think what Frankl was trying to do there was trying to assess his patients, not using kind of reductive methods of like medicine and just like, just getting them a prescription for something and then just like tossing them off, which unfortunately that's kind of what from what knowledge of some psychiatrists actually do, is like they don't really have a discourse with their clients, and they don't tell them, hey, like this is, trying to appraise, like at the end of the day, like some things like depressed, like why are you depressed, like why, going back to why, as the quote kind of motif that Frankl goes back to a lot in Man's Search for Meaning is the Nietzsche one, he who can bear almost any why can bear almost any how, which is like, it sounds simple, these simple kind of truths that almost sound platitudinous or whatever, or if that's a word, but yeah, it almost sounds like kind of like a shibboleth, like just like, okay, well, easy for you to say, blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't easy for him to say. It's like, these are things that, he went through, right? I mean, he was born in, I want to say 1904, I think, passed away in 1997, so he was like well into his 90s. Similar to kind of what Eddie Jaku went through, Jegowitz, I think I talked about him on my channel, author of The Happiest Man on Earth, and, they both lived these rich, long lives, and that's just kind of, it's almost like the proof is in the pudding. It's like, even in spite of the horrors, they still, the worst hand they were dealt, they still managed to live a long life in spite of all those things. And, that's not saying that you should go through these things. And that's the thing that he kept going back to. There's another book I really like. I think it's called, gathered from some of his lectures, I think, from Vienna, called, I think, it was Search for, like, Meaning in Spite of Everything, I think. And yeah, he talks about there being, when you're at your complete lowest and you have no why to search for, like you're completely asking, your dearth of, like, seems like there's no meaning left to life, or, no reason to continue living. Always search for, like, there's, even in the lowest moments that Frankl went through, and his people that had it worse than him even, always go back to, like, well, is there anything whatsoever, like the moment, certain, like, patients he had, that, I think he had some patients that was, like, an executive advertiser kind of person he was into kind of the art of advertising, I guess, and he never really had time to look at himself or take inventory of his life, and when he ended up having a cancerous tumor, he actually ended up reorganizing his life and kind of reassessing what was going on, and ended up actually learning in that time to kind of value his time, and ended up actually reading a ton of different books, and then fell in love with reading. I think he ended up learning how to play an instrument, and just have time to reflect on all the stuff that he was working so hard towards, and he never had time to stop. And now, with this illness that he had, it ended up taking his life, unfortunately, but it gave him meaning in a weird way. Paradoxical, it almost seems. But it was always what he says that, sorry, I turned my guitar there. It's always that, Frankl said that it was the people in the camps, that it wasn't necessarily those who came up with, like, certain tricks, or like certain like attitude type, like, like just be positive, or positive all the time. But it was more people who had a reason to live for, thing like a wife to go home to, something that the capos or the Gestapo, they could never take that away ever. So they kept, they were able to make it out of there. Sometimes, like, it would just go down to the absolute kind of will to live was completely just taken away. Sometimes there were those who were subject to machine gun fire for no other reason, just to satiate some sick, inhuman, monstrous Germans' bloodlust, and there was no other reason for that. But it was those that, when like the complete absolute epitome of drudgery, or subjecting to the utter T, like, how much can this bow, like, how much can we bend this before it breaks? And it was like those at the very tipping point of, like, even the moments, like Frankl said that he was like, there was a moment when it went down to the very like a train that was taking to deliver them, and there was a chance that odds were against him. That was like, it was a 70-something% chance that, or I mean, it might have even been 90, that he would have not made it on that train that saved his life. And he was lucky enough not to have been there. Now, there's some controversy, I think, in the sense that I think there's another Holocaust survivor who said that Frankl wasn't being entirely upfront about that, because he was suggesting that perhaps he was in Auschwitz for months and months, but actually what happened, I think, is that he was only in the actual camp for some days, which I'm not sure what to make of that exactly, because maybe he didn't make it through the full-fledged thing, but I don't think that makes him any less. I think because of his status as a psychologist and already kind of established career as being, in medicine at least, I think that kind of gave him a bit of a one-up, and I think he was pretty honest about that. I don't know if he was like saying, like, he tried to use what he could for good, trying to help patients that he had who were, and prescribing them the right medication if they were sick and they fell ill. And yeah, it was all a bit, everything was a bit difficult to figure out what was going on. The chronology, especially of, like, people's hold on time was completely just different at that time. But yeah, and Frankl, he dedicated his life to trying to find, get to the nitty-gritty what purpose is there to life. And it just keeps, like, it's almost like a weird evolutionary kind of thing, where it makes sense for us to think about certain things, like things like, it doesn't make any sense evolutionary for us to have as many offspring as we can endlessly, just to go off and just have endlessly, like, oh, well, we have to find a mate, we have to have as many mates as we can. That doesn't make any sense, because I think that's almost like a byproduct of evolution that's not really auspicious or conducive to how we survive. So we have other things, like psychological things that we have also that don't seem to really make sense, like people with bad vision, or an extra chromosome that reduces in certain mental illnesses, or but things that we have, like, which is a bizarre thing, because it's like with the eugenics program of, like, the Nazis had, when to kill off people who were struggling, people who were old and were no longer of use to society and a burden on society, like, they just, like, throw them out. And that's something I'd like to talk about in Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. Is a great book that details, like, how the Nazi got a bunch of kind of unwilling, kind of average Joes, to put it kind of simply, who didn't really actually care all that much about the Third Reich and the future of Germany. They didn't really have a lot of stake and a lot of hold in that, but they were somehow not seduced, but, like, convinced. They're like, just take gun, liquidate the ghetto, like the Krakow ghetto. Just like it was anonymous people, but they had that because of the power that anonymity had. The fact that after the war they could safely go back to their homes. Like, let's just get this out of the way. And a lot of them were sickened to their stomachs too. These SS certain machine gunmen, not the kind of the gung ho like I love Hitler, these type of people, but yeah. So that's what a lot of it comes down to. Is like Frankl too made a very good point about some of the camp guards, like the capos, who were actually Jewish, actually treated their own kind, like their own flesh and blood, worse than the Germans did, which was like surprising to me. So yeah, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, definitely recommended. Quick read too. It's not written in I remember maybe reading it when I was like 22. I don't think I read all that much kind of like really big, kind of psychological tomes before that. So it was definitely a kind of an easy read. Not also like, although obviously there were parts that were hard to get through on just a kind of a historical level of just what the Holocaust was and how that went about. But aside from that, it wasn't difficult to kind of, the words weren't difficult to process. So yeah, I definitely recommend that. And yeah, I think that's all I have for now. Thanks for watching.